we've observed in the literature and also in our clinical experience that descriptions that people give of experiences they can encounter with high doses of classic hallucinogens can often be quite similar, if not indistinguishable, from descriptions that people can give of experiences that they've had in a long-term meditation retreat, after deep contemplation, prayer, spontaneously, or under sensory deprivation conditions. This is really kind of a unique experience that we want to explore. And on one hand, you have this pharmacologically mediated experience with hallucinogens. On the other hand, you have this completely non-pharmacologically mediated, well, when you get into the brain, everything is pharmacological at one level or another, but putatively not pharmacological with meditation and other things. So this is a quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson. I've never had any revelations through anesthetics, but a kind of waking trance, this for lack of a better word, I have frequently had, quite up from boyhood, when I've been all alone. This has come upon me through repeating my own name to myself silently till all at once as if it were, etc., etc. So you can consider this in terms of a concentration practice, or maybe more specifically a mantra practice. And from boyhood, Lord Tennyson had this experience. He would repeat his name to himself over and over and over again until at once his self dissolved. We have dissolution of the self. This is a core feature of the mystical experience. And this quote I grabbed from William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience. His 16th and 17th lectures deal with mysticism, and he was using a number of quotes from a variety of literature sources to try to build the case that the mystical experience is a thing, and it has a structure, and the structure is reliable, and there are dimensions that keep popping up in what we can define as a mystical experience. And this is one of the pieces of information that Walter Stace used half a century later to build a more comprehensive model of mystical experience. So we have this. Okay, not drug occasions. Let's try again. In my mind's eye, I felt myself instinctively taking on the posture of prayer. I was on my knees, hands clasped in front of me, and I bowed to this force. I wasn't scared or threatened in any way. It was more about reverence. I was showing my respect. I was humbled and honored to be in this presence. This presence was a feeling, not something I saw or heard. I only felt it, but I felt it more real than any reality I have experienced. And it was a familiar place, too, one I had felt before. It was when I surrendered to this that I felt like I let go. I was gone, or should I say this earthly part of me was. It was still in some sort of suspended animation, awaiting my return. I was in the void. The void had a strange and indescribable quality to it, in that there was nothing to it but this feeling of unconditional and undying love. It felt like my soul was basking in the feeling of this space. I have no idea how long this lasted. Time and space did not exist there. It was all different manifestations of this love feeling I found myself wrapped in. This is a next day session report from one of our study volunteers in the dose effects study. This is a description a person gave of their experience, and it's beautiful in many ways, not least of which is that what I have bolded here, she pointed out clearly all of the 6 dimensions of a classic mystical experience that Stace hypothesized: reverence or sacredness. More real than any reality I've experienced. We call that noetic quality. And in the void is a classic description of an internal unity experience where all boundaries dissolve and there is no I, there is just this void. And strange and indescribable quality to it. It's often ineffable. Unconditional and undying love. This is deeply felt positive mood. And time and space did not exist. This is a transcendence of time and space. So it's by these 6 dimensions of experience that we define a mystical experience. We don't ask people, did you have a mystical experience? We have them fill out, which is admittedly kind of a long questionnaire. But asking them, how much did you feel love? How much did you feel joy? How much did you feel ecstasy? How much did time exist? How much did space exist? How much was this a reverent or a sacred experience? And it's by those responses that people give that we try to discern whether or not we think this was a mystical experience. Some descriptions may be indistinguishable between those that are drug occasioned and those that are not when we're talking about this unity, this mystical experience. So we have here some kind of anecdotal and qualitative evidence that maybe there are places that can be reached with meditation that are also places that can be reached with pharmacology. And that begs the question of, well, what's the underlying thing that we're looking at here? What can we learn about consciousness from studying both meditation and classic hallucinogens like psilocybin? So we have this qualitative evidence that these may bring you to similar places, but we have more than that as well. Some data that Robin Carhart-Harris presented a little earlier with psilocybin can be directly compared to data that's been recently developed in neuroscience studies of meditation. So Dr. Judd Brewer at Yale in 2011 published an article. These are data that he collected in the fMRI scanner while people were meditating. He compared people who were novice meditators with people who were expert meditators. And he compared the brain activity that they exhibited while they were meditating in the scanner, and he found that the brains of expert meditators showed decreased activity in two regions of the default mode network. One is the medial prefrontal cortex here. It's a very interesting region. It's a very complex region, but processes have been ascribed to this region, including aspects of autobiographical memory recall, especially binding memories and emotions together, doing theory of mind processes, so thinking about someone else's thoughts, forming a theory of someone else's mind, forming a theory of your own mind. What would I think in this situation? But also this posterior cingulate cortex region in the back that mediates processes such as making decisions about yourself. Does this adjective describe me? Is this face, this image of a face, is that my face? Is this something that I would do? These really, truly self-referential processes. And some of these processes are the reasons that people ascribe ego integrity or self-referential processing to this posterior cingulate region. And you can notice if you compare these two, both medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate are deactivated both in expert meditators during meditation and also during the acute effects of psilocybin using two different brain imaging modalities, BOLD and CBF. We can take this a little further. A few years after that initial publication, Dr. Brewer and Kathleen Garrison published a neurofeedback study where they had people in the scanner and they basically in real time would project a graph of how activity in the posterior cingulate was changing over time. So this is a graph of how one individual's posterior cingulate activity was changing over time. Red is active and blue is deactive compared to a baseline. They had a few different studies and a few different instruction sets, but generally in one study they said try to meditate and watch what happens to the blue and the red. And in a follow-up study, they said, okay, you've noticed that the blue, by your own report, when you were meditating successfully, it was more blue than red. Now try to make it blue. And through these things, and through then asking people afterwards what happened, it was pretty clear that successful meditation aligned with deactivation of the posterior cingulate cortex. So it's a lot more direct evidence that these two processes are linked. And deactivation of the posterior cingulate really strongly correlated with dissolution of self, right? And we can go even further. Just this year was a study published by Dr. Michael Kometer in Franz Vollenweider's lab in Zurich, and they showed through yet another brain imaging modality, EEG, a decrease in neuronal synchronization in this posterior cingulate cortex region during spiritual experiences with psilocybin. So we have on one hand a growing sense that from a qualitative and an anecdotal perspective, these two paths can lead to a similar place of unity, mystical experience. And we have now a growing neurobiological literature to support that from 3 different brain imaging modalities, 3 different labs looking at dissolution of self and the posterior cingulate. So our question now, one of the things we know at Hopkins is from our previously published studies with psilocybin, we've given psilocybin in 2 studies to completely healthy individuals who have no hallucinogenic experience. We know we can occasion mystical experiences in these individuals with fairly high reliability, and that is a bit dose dependent. We know that now. Also, people who are otherwise healthy, hallucinogen naive, but may have a problem with addiction, we know that we can administer psilocybin to these individuals as well and evoke a mystical experience. And the 2 unpublished studies that should be coming out soon, I hope, the cancer and anxiety study and also a spiritual practice study within which we administer psilocybin to individuals who are initiating meditation practice. We know we can evoke mystical experience in these folks as well. So what do we do now? We're going to ask the question of whether or not so if we administer psilocybin now to an individual who has a long-established practice in their life, such as a Buddhist meditation practice, that in and of itself, without hallucinogens, can lead to this mystical experience, what will people say? Will they say, yeah, these are the same thing. These both lead me to exactly the same place. Or will they say, well, they're similar, but they're not exactly. I can see how people can confuse them. Maybe they'll say they're complementary. They're not alike, but they're complementary and they can help each other. And or we may find people say, well, no, these are apples and carburetors. It's not even food. It's just completely different. Why are you doing this to me? And we could even have an experience like the anecdote from Ram Dass's guru, right? The story goes Ram Dass gave his guru a bunch of LSD, and I heard 2 stories, right? One was that he just laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. The other is that he just said, nothing happened. I live here. This is where I am. So maybe established meditators live in such an altered state of consciousness that this really doesn't perturb the system. So that's the question we want to ask. And the questions that you can ask following that are, if we see that there are similar spaces, then maybe some benefits that are ascribed to meditation can also be investigated with hallucinogens, and I think some of those are being investigated. But that's the premise of this study that we're running right now. We have a target of 40 individuals, and we've enrolled 18 so far. We have not completely set in stone, but rather rigorous intake criteria in terms of the meditative practice that you have. We use one metric, which is lifetime hours of meditation, and the average is 4,400 hours of meditation in a lifetime, and I believe that's roughly equivalent to meditating an hour a day every single day for 12 years. So the people in our study are rather experienced, and that's not everybody in the study meditates an hour a day. I think we ask for people who have a daily or near daily practice, like 6.5 days a week, right? And they all have extensive meditation retreat history as well. So if you can imagine someone going on a week-long retreat once a year, and during that week-long retreat they're meditating for 8 hours a day, that starts to add up. But this is what the equivalent is, and the maximum, the person with the most experience has 17,000 lifetime hours of meditation. I believe that's upwards of 40 years of meditating an hour a day every single day. So these are pretty experienced individuals. Just under half of the individuals have prior hallucinogen use, and this is important because one of the things we want to capture in this study is the very first interaction between an established meditative practice and this high-dose hallucinogen experience. So we are really interested in the opinions of people who have integrated these two things in their practice, but they're not as scientifically interesting in this particular case because they're already there. We want to see the first-hand experience. Just under half of the people in the study have prior hallucinogen use, but they've all ended their hallucinogen use before the establishment of their meditative practice. But the flip side of that is more than half of the sample is hallucinogen naive. So we have two studies in this project. In the first study, we ask people to consume a moderately high dose of psilocybin or placebo. It's a placebo-controlled partial crossover design. And we can talk about placebo. So placebo control keeps popping up. And one of the reasons we talked an awful lot about this when we were designing this study. One of the reasons we went with a placebo control is because the preparation and the study conditions are such that they're very supportive. We have people lying on a couch with eye shades and headphones for 6 to 8 hours. And we also have them get up and meditate every hour. Every hour in study one, people get up and meditate. They do focused awareness practice, which is essentially mindfulness of breath or really strict concentration practice. We have metta loving kindness or heart-opening practice, and we have open awareness or non-dual awareness, where the object of focus is anything that arises in consciousness, but without attaching to it. So we have people do this, so it's a lot. And the preparation that goes into leading up to a session can also be pretty intense, getting to know someone on a very deep level and building trust and rapport. So we have a placebo control to control really, and as Dr. Drelio kind of pointed out, this is not necessarily a placebo effect that we would observe, but rather a care effect, and I completely agree with that. And that's one of the things we're trying to control is expectation and context up to and including the beginning of the session. And so that's study one. And in study one, we do MRI imaging before and the day after each high-dose session. And I'm not going to present the MRI data because those are also in progress and we're not even done collecting our sample. And study two, we actually study people under the acute effects of a moderately low dose of psilocybin. We have people meditate in the scanner. And that's going to be really fascinating work, but we're not done that either. But I kind of wanted to lay this out and answer just a couple initial questions. And one initial question is, so far, how are people doing? What impact does this experience have on people with long-term meditative practice? The red bars are ratings that people have given 2 months after having had a high-dose psilocybin session as their first session. And the blue bars represent ratings that people have given 2 months after having received a placebo session. Where there are differences, I think it's important to note. You have more of a sense of the preciousness of life. Spirituality has become more central to your life. You're a more authentic person. You're more honest with yourself. You're more tolerant towards others. You experience more inner peace. You experience more joy. You experience profound sacredness more frequently. You feel more at home in the universe. You feel more certain about the intrinsic worth of each individual. You have an increased belief in a higher consciousness. The take-home is what impact does this have on people? A positive impact. Just in general in their lives. And now if we just consider what impact this experience has had so far in people's meditative practices, 75% of individuals who received a psilocybin session 2 months after their first session, indicated that that experience was within the top 10 most personally meaningful experiences of their life, and also within the top 10 most spiritually significant experiences of their life. This can't really be understated. These are people who have been meditating half an hour to an hour a day for a decade plus. These are people with very established meditation practices. These are people who say, yeah, I did all those things, but this experience I had with psilocybin at Johns Hopkins was within the top 10. Positive effects on a person's sitting awareness practice. 67% of individuals who had psilocybin indicated it had a positive effect. 43% of individuals who received placebo had indicated a positive effect on sitting awareness practice. And that's important too, because that really goes to the power of the set and setting that we develop, and the rapport and the container that we develop for this experience to happen. And 83% of individuals indicated, who had psilocybin, indicated a positive effect of the experience on their non-sitting awareness practice. So this is the previous slide. What is it doing to people's, what impact is this having on people's lives? Positive. This slide, what impact is this having on people's meditative practices? Positive. To give you just a little more in-depth of an understanding of how people are experiencing these things and what they're reporting they experienced, I have 3 vignettes and then one more. These are quotes from individuals, and next day, subjective reports after a psilocybin session. So this first individual is a meditation teacher with 2,200 lifetime hours of meditation. That's roughly equivalent to an hour a day every single day for 6 years. What he experienced was a taste of the third noble truth. It is possible to end suffering. Suffering has an end. It is not home, not where I belong. I felt at home, at peace, where I belong. It was truly amazing. So this is an individual for whom their experience was exactly linear with what he had experienced on meditation retreats and on the cushion, except it was a deepening and extension of that experience that he had never encountered before. The next individual has roughly twice the amount of meditation experience. This is actually roughly equivalent to 13 years, an hour a day. Pure body and pure awareness, all and everywhere, nowhere. This is where this person was. A truly unified experience. They indicated they had experienced before, but they absolutely experienced it here. And this following person has 12,000 plus hours of meditation over 20. This is actually roughly equivalent to an hour a day for 32 years, but they had quite a few meditation retreats that were multi-month-long meditation retreats. I replayed all of the peak experiences I had ever had while meditating. And this final one, this is a growing awareness of the lack of separation between self and other. I feel a total lack of duality. No good or bad, no yesterday or today, no sorrow or joy. The experience is of the unity of all things and the complete incompetence of language. I am aware that language actually keeps us in a state of suffering, of separation, by naming things like life and death. It seems like these dualities are fictions. So there's an awful lot of really amazing work going on, and some really incredibly wonderful researchers who you've already seen who are really focusing in on helping to heal those who are ill, helping to treat those who are suffering, and I think that that is one of the most noble causes that you can have. These are healthy individuals who are also experiencing deep benefits from this experience. And people who, I mean, it's a really conservative case, right? These are people who, in many ways, have worked out a lot of the things that they've had to go through, and they've had a lot of time to work and built a lot of tools that have helped them to, overcome suffering in life, but they can still reap the benefits of this experience. And I want to take just a minute or two to let you know all the other things that we're doing at Hopkins right now. I told you about 3 studies we've published so far, looking at mystical experiences in healthy individuals and also the value of psilocybin as an adjunct to smoking cessation. Recently published where in an open label pilot study using psilocybin as an adjunct to smoking cessation, 80% of individuals were abstinent at 6 months. I believe the gold standard pharmacology solution to smoking cessation is varenicline, and that's 26% abstinence at 6 months. So that's a pretty amazing finding. And as amazing as the findings that are being reported for depression, I think. We also have soon to be published a study of cancer and depression and anxiety, so psilocybin aid in treating this, and we see a steep decrease in depression and anxiety after a high-dose psilocybin session. Individuals who use psilocybin as an adjunct to initiating a meditation practice, the take home there is psilocybin can help establish a new meditation practice as well. Ongoing research at Hopkins, a long-term meditator study that I told you about. We also have a study in religious leaders. It's a multi-site study with NYU, asking the question of whether mystical experiences will aid religious professionals in their ministry. We also have 2 trials going on that are local to Baltimore. Smoking cessation clinical trial, phase 2 randomized control trial of psilocybin as an aid to smoking cessation. And also a study of the effects of hallucinogens and other drugs on mood and cognition. We also have a couple of completed survey studies, but some ongoing survey studies if you're interested, for people who have experienced a reduction in alcohol or other drug use after taking a psychedelic, and for people who have had a personal encounter with the divine, the G word, God, or ultimate reality, however you approach that. I also want to just thank the incredible team of individuals who's involved in this work.
Thank you.